Thank you everyone for joining us for our webinar today, which is another one in our series on climate finance, this time focused on natural climate solutions and what are some of the barriers to enabling natural climate solutions to really achieve the scale and impact that they have the potential to do. I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping before I introduce our two speakers. My name is Rebecca Fay. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Natural Capital Partners. This is a half-hour conversation with no PowerPoint, as promised in our promotion of it. It's designed to be an interesting and possibly not, I don't think controversial, but engaging conversation between Jonathan and Justin. It will be recorded, so the link will be available to everyone afterwards to share with colleagues. And please put your questions through the question box on the sidebar, and we will cover those throughout the webinar. So to get started, I'm very, very pleased to introduce our two speakers. So Justin Adams, who is Executive Director of the Tropical Forest Alliance, has a long history in the forestry space, and I'll let Justin say a little bit more about his background when I hand over to him. And Jonathan Shopley, who I hesitate to refer to Jonathan as a veteran, but he has worked in the carbon markets for a very long time, has a deep knowledge of what works in the carbon markets, what's challenging, and how businesses are using climate finance to deliver impact on our climate challenges. Before I hand over to Justin and Jonathan, we'd like to start with a quick poll. So if everyone could respond to these, the question here that you'll see in front of you, are you clear about how natural climate solutions can fit into your business strategy? And you'll see there that there's 4 different possible responses, ranging from a very confident yes to a very not lacking in confidence, but a very definitive no, and the range in between. So let us know what you think about that that question, and I'll just wait for the answers to come up. Great, and here we can see, an interesting range, I would say. So not a definitive yes, and we're already using them. Quite a lot of an equal amount of somewhat but needs more work. So I think that this is going to be a really valuable webinar for you in terms of those people who want to understand a bit more about how they can use natural climate solutions, and also for those people who are already using them to give their perspectives and their thoughts on what Justin and Jonathan have to say. So Justin, I'm going to start with my question to you and then leave you and Jonathan to get on with your conversation. So Justin, can you first of all start by describing a little bit about your role at the World Economic Forum, and some of the programs you're working on there with the Trillion Trees and the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance and so on, and tell us a little bit about what's taken you to that role and what you're finding, what you find sort of most challenging in some of the things you're trying to deliver on.
Rebecca, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you for the conversation this afternoon. So my role, actually, we have just built a platform for accelerating nature-based solutions at the World Economic Forum, which combines our work with the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is about stopping commodity-driven deforestation. The platform, or the initiative, we launched at Davos this year that rather infamously was promoted by President Trump, but about the Trillion Trees and how we can really use restoration as a galvanizing call to action for what more can be done to restore health to ecosystems around the world. And then thirdly, a platform called Nature Action Agenda, which is how we bring CEOs and heads of state together to really champion the cause for nature and really look at this link between the biodiversity COP and the climate summit, both of which meetings have now been postponed to 2021, but both critical international meetings. And then lastly, this alliance that's a partnership together with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development called the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance. which is really about how we can do a lot of what we're going to talk about today, but how can we use carbon finance as a mechanism for meeting corporate climate commitments. So we brought all of those together. There's lots of synergies across those various initiatives, and we're looking at how we can use the World Economic Forum's extraordinary convening power to really drive forward the potential for nature-based solutions. And perhaps just to say briefly on that, I'm sure it was interesting just the poll answers, but you know, everybody's here because they recognize this plays a part. The science tells us that at least a third of the solution to the climate challenge could come from nature. And so we know the technical opportunity is there, but we have struggled for years in terms of how we turn that potential into reality. And as I reflect on where we are, it's still, you know, we've got all sorts of people working really hard, but we are still in what I would think of as a cottage industry. And one of the interesting things for me is that I've been working on the climate challenge for more than 20 years in private sector, with the World Bank, with the Nature Conservancy, and now at the World Economic Forum, and really looking at how we can unlock the power of nature to address so many of the challenges that we're facing. And I think in a post-COVID recovery, that becomes ever more important. But what's interesting to me is that Jonathan and I first worked together 20 years ago, looking at this exact challenge and this exact question, and we've both sort of pursued parallel paths since then. And so I've almost got a question for Jonathan. Here we are 20 years on, when we first started talking about forests, and yet we have not achieved anything like the potential that we know exists, and we know, frankly, is going to be critical to have a thriving planet and a thriving communities in the future.
Well, Justin, what a great introduction, and thank you, and really thank you for joining us today, and also casting back, you know, that critical 20 years that we've had in our different paths, and you know, what I'd like to do is sort of acknowledge that many of the things that you've done in the World Bank, in TNC, now at WEF, have all helped build natural climate solutions to where it is today. You know, deeply, you know, widely recognized and deeply respected as a, you know, a really addressable part of the climate solution. But to your question, because I think we're all probably frustrated by the fact that we're still way off the financing mechanism, the financing levels that we need to restore, protect, replant at the scale at which the trillion trees is set out for us. So just a reflection on that. You know, we worked together, and I left to join this company when it was called Future Forests, and it was planting trees in UK woodlands to sequester carbon. So we do, indeed, you're right. We've been at it for 20 years, and now when we look back, you know, have we really scaled up? We've definitely scaled up. Our business has grown. The number of projects we've supported has grown. It's there are portfolios of projects right around the world. But in relation to the scale of climate change, we're a pimple on the problem, is probably what I would say, to be polite. And you know some of the reasons that scale has been an issue, scale and impact, and I'll recite them from our side, our perspective. So, you know, I joined this company really because I liked the commercial model, and which was really built on internalizing the externalities of climate change. In other words, trying to price in social, environmental, and economic costs of climate change. And in order to do that, you know, our business model is always focused on the clients, and many of those are on this call today, and relating their footprint to climate, to carbon neutral, or now, you know, aligning a corporate strategy with net zero, or the net zero global economy that's enshrined in the Paris Agreement. Now, by relating a client's footprint or corporate's footprint to the measures for compensating for unabated emissions, our hope has always been that this becomes a commercial solution that adds business value and becomes part of how corporates evolve their strategy, both tactically in relation to climate, by going carbon neutral, and strategically over the longer term. In other words, taking on a price of carbon through the offsetting mechanism that is in that compensation piece, and using that to drive deeper reductions, abatements internally. Now, during that first 10 years, a lot of our projects that clients were investing in were in the problem part of this. In other words, emissions from fossil fuel emissions. So a lot of the projects were renewable energy, fuel switching, energy efficiency. But now, through the good work of the conservation bodies, and as we get closer and closer to the atmosphere's capacity to absorb new greenhouse gases, the focus has shifted to removals from the atmosphere. And while we strongly believe that you've got to use a bit of an analogy of a bathtub, in other words, if you're really going to solve a problem of an overflowing bath, you want to slow down the rate at which it's filling up. So in other words, continue to address all of the solutions that avoid or reduce emissions, and at the same time, bring in some of the removals. And now, specifically to the issues that we have had to address along the way, the permanence of forestry as an offsetting mechanism has always been a bit of an issue. In other words, when you make a claim of neutrality, you need to be sure that it's permanent. The standards that have evolved in this space have been hugely helpful in providing buffers and insurance and to address that piece. But then the other thing about natural climate, or the couple of things about natural climate solutions, is land under forestry is often under the governance of national governments, and very few across the globe have got really strong plans, biodiversity or forestry plans in place that are funded and supported. There's a land tenure issue. Sometimes the land is owned by private landowners or still owned by the state, but it's quite difficult to get that permanence issue resolved. And then finally, compared to some of the fossil fuel avoidance and reductions, there's no big technology associated with it. So we don't have corporations coming in with kit that's going to find us. This is about behavior change, attitude change, and that takes a long time, and it takes a lot of effort. So without offering those as sort of excuses for how we haven't scaled up, I would say that all of that experience has sort of brought solutions to those kinds of issues. And what you've been doing in that 20 years is building an awareness and putting natural climate solutions center stage and getting real recognition for the value of that. And it's what we do now as we go forward that sort of releases the power of both.
Yeah, that's terrific, Jonathan. And the work you've done, and others like you who've been working on the ground and really trying to identify how do we address so many of these technical issues, I think has been absolutely crucial. But as I step back and look at where we are and the incredible importance of this as a sector, I've sort of listed 5 key barriers that I think are there. Number 1 is technical. 2 is regulatory or political. 3 is financial. 4 is institutional or organizational. And 5 is ideological. And I think we've made progress on all of them. But I think crucially, I think most of the technical barriers have been addressed and removed. And it's extraordinary how much work has been done that's probably not well recognized, but the accounting principles, the standards, I think lay the foundation for kind of actually technically we know what can be done. I think the regulatory and political remain a challenge when we think of the global stage, and there's an awful lot of attention focused on Article 6 and whether or not there's going to be agreement on Article 6. And I think it's an incredibly important discussion, but I also would hesitate to think that we put all of our cards on an international agreement as the only path for how we can make progress here. I think there's lots of good domestic schemes. The California system's already working. Colombia's got a tax. Peru is looking at things. So there's action at that subnational level and national level, which I think can actually really help accelerate progress in the next few years. And again, we know how to regulate some of this. I think the institutional or organizational challenges remain. I think there's been an awful lot put onto some of the multilateral development banks. I look at the work the World Bank's doing, and again, they've been extraordinary in terms of advancing some of the technical issues. But they're also still sitting on $1 billion of cash, and they're also tied up in kind of requirements that donor governments have insisted that are in place before that money can flow. And I think we've got to be thinking, what are the right institutional or organizational mechanisms for how the money can actually reach the ground? I think a lot of the private sector and project development type organizations play an incredibly important role. But we've got to, there's also this sort of divide that exists between jurisdictional approaches and project approaches, which we could sort of get into and speak about for hours, but generally people switch off after 30 seconds. So, but I think, you know, institutionally, how does some of this work is, I think, important. And I think there are some interesting innovations around what public-private partnership might actually look like to do some of this at a scale that's going to be needed on the ground. And I think once we start solving some of those, I think the fourth barrier around financial, my sense is that there is significant amounts of private sector capital lining up. We already know there are significant amounts of donor capital, but that donor capital has been setting the rules for the last decade or 2 decades that we've been working on this. And somehow now we've actually got to think, what is it going to take to create a functioning market that can get to scale? And I think we are on the cusp of that, and I expect to see some major sort of advances over the next 12 months as we look at some of the national schemes, as we look at how we can get to scale. And then the last barrier I mentioned is the ideological barrier, which is an area I've spent a lot of time working, because there is a sense, and it's a problem the environment community has overall, of making the perfect the enemy of the good. I think we've got to recognize that what we desperately need now is progress rather than perfection. And I think we have to also, it's so important as we position natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions, that this is not an alternative to still dramatically reducing emissions. There was a group of organizations actually sent out a letter yesterday, 71, I think, signatories on that letter, calling out 4 principles where this can't be a substitute for cutting emissions. This has to also be emphasizing the importance of conserving and protecting existing ecosystems, not just the planting of new. It has to be socially responsible. It has to be ecologically responsible. And I think if we can ensure there's alignment around some of those principles, even at a high level, we can get over some of the ideological barriers. But there will be some ideological barriers that remain, because there are, you know, a number of people who think there is just no way we can put a price on nature, and that this is only a mechanism for continuing business as usual and everything else. So I think some of those ideological barriers are still there, but I think we also have a path to how we can get beyond that. And so I think in each of those 5 barriers, there's a way forward, but we've got to now bring everybody together and really think, how do we accelerate over the next, I think, 12 to 24 months, because I think we are at a juncture where we can actually start to make all of this real.
So Justin, those are 5 great points. I'm just going to pick up a couple of items out of those. I'm not going to respond to each one of them, because I largely agree with your analysis.
Disagreement's good as well. We don't disagree, but sorry, Karen.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the issue, as we talk to each other, you've got 1 trillion trees, which is a big, hairy goal, which is really, you know, energizing. And then what I'm looking for is the connection between that and what happens on the ground. And I think you've touched on a lot of those things. It's operationalizing that and making sure that we really have, you know, the finance, the project development capacity, government support, etc., all in there. I'm not sure that we're disagreeing, but we're sort of seeing it from different angles and probably see different barriers in different ways. So a couple of sort of pointed responses. You've mentioned that national jurisdictions have a variable response, and we do need forest forest protection, biodiversity protection is so contextual. We need really to have national plans that we can plug those public-private partnerships into. Now, what's encouraging for me, I mean, we might be desperately pulling our hair out at how slow the Paris Agreement has been in getting to a proper rule book that addresses Article 6. But what's intriguing to me is it's inspired another initiative within the biodiversity community saying that idea of having nationally determined contributions, targets for greenhouse gases, we need to have national plans for biodiversity and forest. And once we've got those, then we have attachment points. They're almost like investment portfolios from those countries into which private sector funding can find appropriate projects to plug into. The other thing that we've got to recognize, it is a major barrier, is that, as you pointed out, there's an enormous amount of private capital that is waiting for investable solutions. But at the moment, it's the impact investment community that really has the patience to invest in the long periods of time that you need to invest before you get a return on natural climate solutions. But what we both agree on is that if we had a viable global price on carbon that we could rely on to fund these projects, and by robust price, I think we're thinking about sort of the levels at which the EU ETS was operating when it was going, all guns blazing, somewhere around 30 euros or dollars a ton, really starts to make these projects able to return, give a return on investment, from whether it comes from investment funds or in the carbon market. So we're all desperate to see the Paris Agreement and the voluntary market sort of get into the zone where we can, we see a fair price of carbon emerging that is sufficient to really provide that additional wedge of funds. I think those are the ones that I really wanted to pick up on, and maybe just to pass back to you, see if you've got any reflections on that.
Yeah, so I think one thing I mean, be helpful to go backwards and forwards a little bit on, but I no longer believe there will be a global price of carbon anytime soon. But I say that because I believe that there will be a number of national schemes that are built. Indonesia is looking at how it builds a carbon market. And I think in the same way as we saw, the breakthrough for me of Paris was the bottom-up approach, saying, what can you do? What's your best contribution for each country? And we're seeing that now in the biodiversity national action plans as well. And I think the same is true for me of how we're going to get functioning markets. At a time when multilateralism and globalism is in retreat, I think it feels like it's a stretch to say we are going to have a global price on carbon as the key accelerant for this. I think where we've got the voluntary market for the first time overtaking for paying for natural climate solutions, overtaking the amount of money that's been coming from public sources, from donor government sources. So that suddenly it's becoming a significant actor. I think companies are looking for simplicity, for on-ramps, and for scale, which is also still elusive in many cases. But I think that's where countries could and will start to put mechanisms in place that could attract significant amounts of private sector capital for them to accelerate their own climate action. And over time, that may then emerge as more of a globally connected market. But I just struggle to see in the current context that we're facing of how that becomes, that we create global first and then that trickles down to national. I think that's also been perpetuating too much of the classic global north telling the global south how this is going to work. Brazil is desperate to see how they can get payment for ecosystem services to work. Right. But they don't want to just take rules from the global north and see how that's going to work. So I think these opportunities are going to start to emerge over the next few years and create significant on-ramps for where private sector can invest, both to mitigate risk in terms of their own emission footprints, but also to create new business opportunities.
So Justin, just on a point of clarity, I don't believe in top-down carbon markets either, but I do believe that having a global price of carbon would be helpful. So I'm hugely encouraged by the fact that California is linking its cap trade and offset system with Quebec, and I do believe that the voluntary market, which has always been a pioneer in new methodologies of directing finance on a sustainable basis in a way that philanthropy or government grants or World Bank investments don't necessarily deliver on a consistent and ongoing basis. I think that the voluntary markets activities are developing methodologies that can be applied in different markets and sometimes adapted to different domestic markets are helping us sort of grow a global price of carbon from the bottom up. And if it weren't for the voluntary market standards that operate on a fungible cross-national boundary basis, we may not get there. But my hope is that those strands that don't really, that can cross the borders of countries in that multilateral way in which you've explained, combined with the bottom-up drive for investment in climate mitigation and adaptation, will emerge into a matrix that sort of supports the evolution of a global price at a level that really drives scale off of the foundations we've laid so far.
I don't disagree with that as a direction of travel, but I don't think we get to the global price straight away.
No, I couldn't agree more. But in the meantime, I'm hoping that what we see here is a de-risking of the investments, a speeding up at the rate at which private or public capital gets a return, and a mechanism that sort of builds on all of the learnings that we've done over this frustrating, sometimes remarkably rewarding 20 years. Rebecca, I can see you waving, and
yes,
I know
I
that
am
means
waving
time.
because we've had quite a few questions coming in, and I've been very hesitant to interrupt. And there's a few questions which I don't think we're going to get to because about specifically about Article 6 and about NDCs and forestry projects and how they work with NDCs and so on. I think that's a sort of quite a technical, long answer required for those things. So I'm not going to go into that. But there was one question which is about, and you both mentioned biodiversity and climate, and at the moment for many people they're seen as almost two separate things, which is a bit frustrating, I think. And I'm just wondering, one of the questions is, how can you see biodiversity as being an improved driver for companies to integrate natural climate solutions into their strategies? Do you see biodiversity as being a way of getting more onto that on-ramp? More companies, more private sector money.
Justin, why don't you take that first? I think you've got greater and deeper qualifications.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure that's true, but I think the question I would ask is can nature be that bridge? Because I do think we're going to see different debates emerging out of this crisis around the link between nature and people, nature and health, nature and climate. And I think as we start looking at sort of what all of that leads to and how that gets incorporated into this, the criticality of a green recovery and build back better, then I think it broadens the discussion from simply being this is only about sort of solving for climate. This has to be about nature positive. And the other critical thing that we often forget, and for probably the biggest lesson for me of the last 20 years, unless we are putting people at the heart of this, we will continue to fail. This isn't just a conservation and sort of we create wilderness and forget about people. And that's about indigenous peoples and respecting their rights, but it's also about the farmers and the foresters, the many millions of people who live and work on the land who we're going to need to conserve and protect and restore at the scale that we need to solve the climate challenge, to solve for the biodiversity challenge and everything else. So I absolutely think that companies will have different ways of engaging in that going forward. And that's a key part of what we've also done with this Trillion Trees program. Trillion Trees is just a simple message that's a hook to pull people in to this incredibly rich agenda of how supply chain impacts need to be taken into account, of how emission impacts need to be taken into account, and the extraordinary opportunities we've got to build a very different type of society in the future by putting people and nature at the heart of that.
So Rebecca, I know we're on time, so I'm going to keep my reply incredibly short. I'm going to say I agree with everything that Justin says. I think that you know, the biodiversity piece of this is highly contextual. The carbon finance piece will become much more international, much more linking up sources of finance with sources of need. And I think the two complement one another. And I think what we've seen across our client base is a real appreciation that climate and biodiversity are sort of different sides of the same coin, and they are converging in some meaningful way.
Thank you, and we are right on time. I want to apologise to those people who asked questions that we haven't got to. We will try and respond to those separately. I want to thank both of you for this half an hour. We sort of knew wouldn't really be long enough, but you know, we committed for these to be, you know, rapid fire half an hour virtual conversations, since, you know, aware of everyone's time. So thank you both very, very much, and thank you everyone for joining us. And as I said, we will have a link available for anyone who wants to share this.
Thank you. Thanks, Justin. Real pleasure.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for listening. But it's been great.